Art. And we're live.
All right. Welcome in. Welcome in, everybody. How is the weather where you are, Andrew? Because it is very nice and cool over here.
We finally cooled down here in Utah, Peter. It rained last night, and then I woke up to my sprinklers going off, so I felt a little bit irresponsible there. But
Oh, you gotta get a sensor.
I know I need a sensor. My
I just bought one.
is it nice? Can you control your sprinklers from your phone?
No, I can't do that. I do
That's the
have a
dream.
remote control that is not digital or fancy at all, but
Mm,
I did buy a new rain sensor remote thing for my sprinkler system,
mm,
and it's great because now whenever it rains, it automatically doesn't run the sprinkler and you can adjust it so it takes a while to dry out.
that's nice.
It's a nice upgrade for sure.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. That's nice. But yeah, we're pretty rainy here. We cooled off. It was like 100 degrees last week, and now we're looking at a nice 75. So, how about you?
Beautiful. Yeah,
Cooled off? Feeling
it's
good?
been 70s. Last couple of days it's been like mid 70s, dry, sunny. It's been awesome. Yeah.
Love that.
All right. So, welcome everybody to the August RL Property Management webinar. This is for current clients and prospective clients, or just anyone who's interested in hearing me talk about various real estate topics. I'm the co founder and CEO of RL Property Management. We manage about 720 doors here in Central Ohio, mostly single family rentals and small multifamily. We have some folks participating today. We've got a poll. You can feel free to drop questions in the chat. Today's episode or today's webinar is going to be pretty informal. We may jump around a little bit. I've got a few slides here to kick us off, and then we're going to dive into a discussion about the different types of rental properties and how I think about and what I see in terms of their performance and pros and cons. And there's a lot to unpack there. So we will jump into it. So who's talking? Well, I'm Peter Lohman. I'm the owner of RO Property Management, as I mentioned. My background is in engineering, and I also own some rental properties myself. So, my partner and I, who I started this business with, he and I own some rentals. And of course, we are our own customer here at RL Property Management. Our properties are managed with the same exact process that we use for our customers' properties. I love property management, live, eat, and breathe property management nonstop 24/7. I even make memes about property management, believe it or not. And I love just speaking and writing and sharing and trying things, learning, failing, figuring stuff out, and talking to other people in the industry. So if you are a customer of RO Property Management, you are in the hands of someone who spends a lot of time thinking about this industry. The webinar series that we're doing here is designed to help current and prospective owners be more successful and have more confidence with their rental properties. That's our goal with the series. And basically, we want you to feel like you have the knowledge that you want to do what you want to do with rental homes and apartments, whether that's working with a management company like ours, or managing it yourself, or figuring out how to buy your first property. That's our goal. So, what we're going to do today is review our company scorecard, see how we did last month, and we'll share any company updates, a couple reminders, and then we will dive into the different types of properties. And we can do Q&A kind of throughout here. So you don't have to wait till the end to put your questions in. So at RL Property Management, we grade ourselves and we share that publicly right on our website. So this is the updated scorecard for July, or basically the end of July, beginning of August. Median days on market is how long it takes us to lease up a property. Time to turn is how long it takes us to get a property ready to market after the tenant moves out. And you can see some of our statistics and data here. Changes. Average rents are up. Lease renewal is way up. Everything else kind of holding steady. So we're collecting 91% of all rent by the 5th. Feeling pretty good about that, and residents are very happy with how we're handling maintenance. Okay, if you want help finding your next rental property, chat with us because we work with investor friendly agents all the time. We've got a great Rolodex of realtors who really understand in the investor mindset and that we work closely with so they know right how to hand off a property to us. We can connect you with them. Or if you know someone who needs property management, we'd be happy to comp you a month of management just as a thank you. For either of those, you can contact our business development manager, Catherine Lowe. You can see her phone number and her email there, and we'll do our best to help you out. Okay, so today's topic. The question I get asked a lot is, what kind of property should I be looking at? Because there's a lot of different ways you can invest in real estate, which that's really the goal, at least with the folks that I'm talking with. They've made a decision that they want to invest in real estate, but they start reading online. Maybe they go on Bigger Pockets, and they just feel sort of overwhelmed with all the different information out there about duplexes and single family rentals and apartments and student housing and low income. And there's just a lot to think about. And, in 12 years of professional property management, we've managed a lot of different types of properties. I've owned a couple different types of investment properties. And so I'm going to share with you a mix of my personal opinion as well as some data that we've observed in terms of how these properties stack up and the pros and cons of each type of property. So let's jump into our poll. What type of rental property are you most interested in or already own? My guess is we're going to see mostly single family, but it'll be interesting to see the responses here. We'll give it about 30 more seconds. Andrew explained to me how I can configure my Zoom to make my window bigger. So I can't see it from my side, but should be a little easier on the eyes for this month's webinar.
It looks beautiful. I had Kat check it for us, and it's real nice.
Sweet. We're all pro here.
Oh, yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it. We're slowing down a little bit, and we'll share it with everyone here. And you're right.
Yep, single family followed by small multifamily, and then everything else kind of dropped off. Interesting comment from Kimberly. Corporate rental, and Mike mentions land. Great topics. I have less experience with those types, but I'll touch on those. Remind me near the end.
Renting land can be fun. We've got some campsites here in Utah where it's like Airbnb for camping. So if you own a big, multi-acre out in the wilderness or up in the mountains, people will pay you to just go camp on your land and they get privacy and stuff. It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah. Hopefully they don't leave it a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, single family rentals. We'll start with the one that most people are interested in. And some of you are going to be familiar with this, but we'll get into some slides a little further along that may be interesting, even if you already are familiar with single family rentals. So, single family rentals, aka SFR. You got high demand. Typically, these properties rent very quickly, especially compared to apartments. Financing is very straightforward, and your tenants tend to be pretty good. Now, a lot of this just depends on where you buy the property. Location has a huge impact, as much or more than specific property types. But we're going to sort of set location to the side for the purpose of today's discussion and comparing the property types to each other. Downside of single-family rentals is the vacancies really hit you hard. When you have a multifamily property, if you've got 4 units, say, and one of them's vacant, you can usually limp along and at least cover your mortgage payment. Whereas with a single family rental, those 2 to 4 to 8 weeks every other year or every 3 or 4 years that it goes vacant can really feel painful. And we see that with our property owners. If they're going to decide to sell or do something else with the property, it's usually while there's a vacancy. Now, you can sort of negate this by buying a bunch of single family rentals. And then it's kind of like having a multifamily property if you have like 10 single family rentals. And we have investors that we work for that do exactly that. But single family rental is a great place to get started. And it's also great because you can turn a primary residence, of course, into a single family rental just by moving out. You just find another place to live. Wow, you have a single family rental. All you have to do is update your insurance and call us, and you're done. Okay, let me flip forward here a little bit. Yeah, so all right, we're going to talk single family, multifamily, and then I want to do like a little bit of comparison. When you talk about small multifamily, they're similar in a lot of ways to single family, but there are some important differences. Now, you do have shared systems. So, for example, most buildings, whether they have 1 unit or 10 units, are going to have one roof, one water service line, one sewer service line, one electrical hookup to the grid. And so the shared systems, you get some economies of scale there. So that's really nice. The downside is there can be much higher complexity with some of these systems. So, for example, we were looking just recently at some 20-unit buildings near downtown Columbus for somebody who was considering hiring a third-party manager. And these buildings were older and they had a boiler system in the basement. And because of this boiler setup, there was no ability to separate out and submeter for things like water at these individual units or heat because it was all handled by this big boiler in the basement. And the big boiler in the basement, you can't just call the average, Joe plumber or Joe HVAC guy to come fix it when you have an issue. You're dealing with, larger commercial type companies. They may want to put you on contracts in order to even service the equipment. And so there are some downsides there. But it's a great way to scale up. And you meet a lot of investors who start with single family and they eventually move up into the multifamily world. You do see this distinction. 5+ units you often hear referred to as commercial, whereas 2 to 4 units is often still referred to as residential. Both are considered multifamily. Here at RL Property Management, we're happy to manage multifamily. Once we get into the 100+ unit properties where you need on-site management, that is not something that we take on, but we have some other groups in town that we refer those types of properties out to. All right, let me actually flip forward. So small multifamily versus single family, those are the two items from the poll that most people on the call are interested in. So we'll spend a little extra time on these. I'm also the most familiar with these property types, and so I can speak more in detail and in depth about these the distinctions between these property types. So you can typically buy these small multifamily properties at a lower cost per unit. And you also have the advantage of your transaction costs is spread out over multiple units. When you buy a single family home, there's a transaction tax or a transaction cost that's a drag on the investment performance. Recording the title and getting the insurance and paying the realtors and like all these other closing costs. Typically it's like buy the property. So if you buy a property with 4 units, you can kind of spread out those transaction costs. That is an advantage. CapEx per square foot tends to be lower for the reasons I talked about earlier with the shared systems. Once you get into the 5+ unit properties, paradoxically, it can actually be easier to finance them. The 1 through 4 unit properties, unless you get what's called a DSCR loan, which comes with higher interest rates, the banks are typically going to look at your personal income in order to qualify you for the loan. They will discount or even ignore the rent or potential rent income on a single family or a 1 through 4 unit property. And instead, they're just going to look at you, individual investor, as a person. What's your W-2 income? What's your debt payment? Even including things like your car payment. And will you be able to therefore afford the mortgage payment for this property? Almost as if it's like a primary residence. It can be really frustrating, especially if you're an entrepreneur and you kind of have a weird income or like 1099s and stuff. It's very frustrating. On a big 5+ unit multifamily property, those are often going to be financed by looking at the property itself. They don't necessarily care about your personal income because there's an understanding that when you are dealing with a property like this, the revenue from the property is what's being used to pay the mortgage on the property. So they are going to look at your experience level, and they're also going to look at your credit score, but they're not going to be worried as much about your income as they are the performance of the property. And they'll underwrite the property to see how much the rents, are going to cover, and they'll look at like things like your debt service coverage ratio, but it gets easier in a weird way when you're dealing with these larger properties. So multifamily properties are also valued differently. Multifamily properties, they're valued on what's called a cap rate, which is simply the net operating income over the course of a year divided by the purchase price. That's called a cap rate. And so you hear people talk about 4 cap, 5 cap, 8 cap. That's what they're talking about. And so what ends up happening is specific property types and specific geographies tend to trade or transact around a certain cap rate. And the cap rate goes up and down depending on the appetite that investors have for that specific property type, the risk level associated with it, and the cost of money, the cost of financing. So kind of more than I can get into on this webinar, but it's very different from single family, which is based on comps, and also just is super impacted by homeowner demand for that type of home that they want to live there. Whereas in the multifamily world, it's just like it's a straight financial decision for an investor rather than like an emotional decision for a homeowner. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on the broader sort of macroeconomic conditions that are happening. It could be that you would want things to be valued on comps of similar sales, but instead the cap rate is crazy, and so you're not going to take advantage of that, or vice versa. Multifamily properties tend to, in some cases, have more sophisticated property management. This isn't as true as it used to be. There's a lot of sophisticated single-family property managers throughout the United States now. But it used to be that the single-family mom-and-pop property managers weren't very sophisticated compared to the multifamily property management companies. This tends to be very regional and specific to your local market and the specific property managers that are operating where you are. But it is something to think about. The experience of owning a rental property is highly affected by the specific property manager that you're working with. And so if you happen to know there's an outstanding single family property manager where you live, maybe you just go with that and you buy a few single families and let them manage it, rather than taking a gamble on an unknown multifamily property manager, even if theoretically you could find a better deal on a multifamily deal. Multifamily, there's definitely less competition. I mentioned earlier, single family, you're dealing with every individual would-be homeowner bidding against you, looking at the property, touring it, submitting offers, whether or not they plan to turn it into a rental. When you look at multifamily, You exclude all those people and you're only dealing with other investors. So there's just far fewer buyers. So that's nice. Let's look at the disadvantages of multifamily compared to single family. Um, Concentrated risk. So when you have 4 units in one property versus 4 single family units spread around the city, you kind of have more of your eggs in one basket, whether that's a fire or a flood or some sort of change to the local economy in that neighborhood. Your risk is, all eggs in one basket situation. You also only have one exit ramp. So what I just talked about, where the only buyer is potential investors, so you have less people to compete with on the buy side. Well, that's also your only off ramp. So when you go to sell, you don't get to take advantage of those sort of homeowner types who want to come in and bid up the property. You're dealing with cold hard investors on the other end of the transaction, and they're less likely to overpay, less likely to be swayed by emotional factors. And so if you end up with kind of a dog of a property, you are not likely to fool somebody on the exit, and so you're probably going to get paid what it's worth. It's hard to find these properties. Again, this is a regional, but in Columbus, we don't have that many 5 to 60 unit apartment buildings relative to single family, of course. And so you have fewer to choose from. If you are looking to get into single family investing, you have constantly dozens of new properties every week coming up on the market. If you're looking at 5+ unit properties, much harder. There's far fewer of them that come available. The ones that do come available, a lot of them are trading sort of in these off market, or they're handled by these specialty brokerages. They're probably not showing up on the MLS. And so it's just a harder thing. And there's fewer sort of guidebooks on how to do it. The utility submetering at these multifamily properties is a big issue. I talked earlier about that boiler problem where we weren't going to be able to submeter the way we like to for a multi-unit property. In the city of Columbus and most of the neighboring cities, the water company will typically only install one water meter per building, regardless of how many units are in there. And it's up to the property owner to then submeter or install an individual water meter in each unit, take readings, and create the bills. So whereas in a single family unit, you just turn everything over to the tenant, it's pretty straightforward, although there are some complications there. At a multifamily unit, the utilities just are always an issue. You got electric, gas, water. There's a lot to deal with there. There could be common areas. And so you got to know what you're doing, or you'll end up paying a lot of the tenant utility bills and not get reimbursed for those things. Now, a good property manager should be able to walk you through all this and sort of explain the situation at your property and what they recommend. Okay, multifamily buildings, I should say, they have extra expenses that you won't find on a single family. Investors who aren't familiar with these can be caught off guard by these and how significant they can be. Mentioned common areas. Every common area is a source of problems. You've got electric lights that need to be dealt with. You've got heating and cooling. You got to keep it clean. There could be damage. What about access? So anytime you have like an interior hallway, that is a source of potential challenges for management of the building. Landscaping is a big one. So at a single family property, typically the renter is responsible for landscaping. At a multifamily property, the owner is responsible for the landscaping. And landscaping is a big pain. It's a huge pain. It never really does what you want it to do. It's a constant headache, from mowing the grass to all the grass is dead in August, to trimming the bushes, and you got to do mulch every year. And eventually landscaping starts to look very dated, and so you have to replace it. Landscaping can damage the building. It can crawl up the side, of the roof and hang over the roof. It can be a source of pests and squirrels and all kinds of stuff can enter into your building through the landscaping as like an avenue. JD mentioned tree branches falling on the property or anywhere on the property, but on the structure itself. So yeah, big problems with the landscaping. Snow removal. So multifamily building where you have off-street parking. That the expectation there again is that the property owner is going to handle snow removal. So depending on your market, here in Columbus, we do have snow events several times a year, typically that require dealing with the snow in some way. At a single family home, there's no question that the tenant is responsible for that. At a multifamily property with a parking lot, now you've got to engage some kind of a snowplow company to get over there and plow it and salt it and shovel it. And of course, it's such an infrequent event that it's just difficult to get all those resources lined up. Depending on how big your multifamily building is, you may have elevators and sprinklers and secured access. You may have an alarm system. Could be commercial HVAC, like I mentioned boilers, but you can have chillers and these huge complex systems that the average residential technician wouldn't even know where to start with. And you can imagine the bills on those types of things. So lots to think about here. I mean, you can make a ton of money with multifamily, but you got to know what you're doing. And once you get into the larger buildings with some of the sprinklers and elevators and commercial HVAC systems, that's even beyond my experience level. We've managed one or two buildings like that in the past, but typically we're inheriting a set of service contracts, which is pretty straightforward, but there's a lot there. Okay, advantages of small multifamily. So what is good about small multifamily? Well, you can grow quickly. If you're buying 2, 4, 8, 10 units at a time, that's a great way to add units to your overall unit count versus, one, 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 one. Each of those transactions takes up a ton of your headspace and just a lot of brain damage just for a few units. So some of this is from the perspective of the property manager, but you're dealing with more sophisticated clients. So the owners that you're dealing with on the other side of the transaction when you're dealing with multifamily, they tend to be more sophisticated and less difficult to deal with. If you've ever had a homeowner on the other side of a transaction, that can be very challenging. Let me skip forward here a little bit. Got a question in the chat. How long does it take a single family home to rent in a place like the Dublin School District? We're seeing those take about 10 business days right now is our median. If you look at our scorecard, I believe the number was 10. So now this changes seasonally. So we're right at the end of the peak season and things are starting to slow down. But for the past few months, we've been able to lease a property like that in 5 to 10 business days. Okay, let's talk about these larger multifamily properties. So I don't know if anyone here is in the market to buy a 100+ unit multifamily property. If you are, congratulations. That's amazing. There's a couple of property managers who do a great job with these locally, but as I mentioned earlier, these would be outside the scope of our property management company. You're talking sort of the big leagues when you're talking about properties like this. You're going to have on-site property management. So you typically would have one property manager and one on-site technician per 100 doors at a multifamily property or a multifamily apartment community. Those numbers are changing a little bit as the systems that we use as property managers become more sophisticated. And we're starting to see some of these multifamily complexes push those ratios a bit, but that's a good rule of thumb. The thing that's different about these properties too is that that property manager and the technician, their payroll is going to come right out of your property. So whereas all the properties we manage for our property owners, we pay our employees, at a property like this, the staff that's sitting at the property is actually paid out of the property. So their payroll, their pay stub will say, 123 Main Street LLC or whatever, rather than ABC Management Company. These multifamily properties do tend to have higher turnover, tenant turnover. The good rule of thumb for multifamily is 50% turnover annually. So half your units turning over every year. It's a lot to keep up with in terms of turns and leasing. And so if you don't have a property management team that is very organized and disciplined on unit turns and lease ups, you will quickly be underwater, because what ends up happening is the difficult turns that are more expensive get deferred and delayed, waiting for lease ups to happen. And it just as a cascade, because the fewer units you have occupied and leased, the less revenue is coming in every month. And you just end up digging yourself into a really deep hole. So that can be a mess. This is, again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm an expert at these property types. I am not. And I think if you're in the market for a 100+ unit multifamily property, you're probably not comparing it necessarily to single family or small multifamily, because it's just a totally different category. All right, student housing. So we're going to kind of zoom back down to the single family, small multifamily. I'm starting to lose my voice. This is like my third or fourth sort of live event today. Okay, student housing. So we manage a handful of these, and I actually own a couple campus properties as well. We call them OSU area campus properties or student housing. So the rents are higher, as indicated here, higher rent per square foot, because the demand to be in and near that campus area is really high. And you're normally not going to have a problem leasing these homes every year. They do operate on a very different leasing cycle than normal, and we'll talk about that. But as long as you are proactive about your leasing, you're normally not going to have any trouble keeping the units occupied, honestly, like 51 weeks out of every year, which is really nice, because even a great single family rental, traditional rental, tends to have like a month or two vacant every few years. Whereas campus, you can almost keep it 100% every year. Now, these units tend to operate more like multifamily in that they do have like a 50%-ish turnover ratio. Traditional single family rentals, they have a lower, I should say a higher lease renewal rate. So what we find is that we only experience like 20 to 30% of our single family rentals turning over every year, compared to 50% for multifamily. And student housing is definitely more like multifamily, like 50 to 60% turnover every year. So that tends to cause tons of wear and tear on the property, even if you ignore the student aspect of it, which definitely affects wear and tear. So that's something to definitely be aware of. The leasing cycle, just to touch on that briefly, student housing or campus area housing, at least where we are, and I think in a lot of areas, the lease up cycle for the following school year happens in the late fall. So starting in like another month, we're going to be reaching out to our current tenants, which we don't take on new campus rental properties for management, but we have some existing that we've been managing. We'll reach out to them in about a month and start talking to them about a renewal for the following school year, even though they kind of just moved in. It's kind of crazy, but the landlords there, they really want to lock in the best students and the best tenants for that next school year, so they can understand and forecast their occupancy. So, and by Christmas time, by the time everyone comes back for the next semester after Christmas break, that's kind of like your last chance to get everything leased up for the fall. If you don't have it leased up, end of January, February, then you may end up having a very long vacancy once your current tenants move out. So as indicated here, this is something that you really need to know what you're doing if you're going into this. You either need to work with a property manager that manages a lot of properties in this specific area of this type, or if you're going to manage it yourself, you need to know how everything works and have some great systems of your own to make sure you don't get caught off guard. Suddenly it's March and you haven't even started the lease renewals for the next school year, and now you're really in for some pain when the current crop of students moves out. All right, Section 8, everyone's favorite. So we manage I think around 20 Section 8 units right now. This is another one where we're not looking to take these on, but we have some long tenured clients with Section 8 properties. What we're also experiencing is that specific cities and jurisdictions in our service area are starting to require that we accept housing vouchers, aka Section 8. In other words, if a tenant applies for a property and they have a voucher, we can't tell them we don't accept Section 8 in a few specific cities. I believe it's City of Columbus, Westerville, Reynoldsburg, and Bexley. So this is not great. I don't like this policy, but it is what it is. And it means that more and more of our property owners need to understand what it means to own a property with a Section 8 tenant, because they may experience it in the future, even if they didn't set out to become like a low income housing provider. So the toughest part of dealing with Section 8 tenants and the Section 8 process in general is actually not the tenants. It's the housing authority that you're forced to interact with while you deal with the Section 8 tenant. So locally here, we only have one. It's called Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority, or CMHA. The service area of CMHA, confusingly, is Franklin County. It is actually not the City of Columbus, even though it's called the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. And that agency is horrible to deal with. And you can talk to anyone who's had to deal with them, whether it's the request for tenancy approval process or the inspection process or the payment process. It's very, very hard to deal with them. And we've been around and around with them. We've dealt with them for over 10 years. We know some people there, and even then we can barely get the basics taken care of. So if you own Section 8 properties, or you're buying Section 8 properties, or you're buying property in an area where you may end up with a Section 8 tenant, you need to get familiar with what it's like to work with them, or engage a property manager who has experience in that area, because if you don't, you can end up in a lot of trouble or not get your payments for many, many, many months. Now, the tenants who move in with the Section 8 vouchers, in my experience, I've tried to run some data on this, but they tend to be no better or worse than any other tenant in that same category of home. So if you have a home that rents for $900, whether you end up with a Section 8 tenant or an open market private party tenant, your experience with the tenant on average is going to be similar. There used to be, or maybe there still is, some sort of a stigma around Section 8 tenants. I don't really buy that too much. I don't know that we have good data on it either way, and it doesn't really matter in the end, because you should treat everybody the same. But it's not the case that just because you end up with a Section 8 tenant, the property is going to be trashed and it's going to be nothing but problems. That's not true at all. So it's not something to be scared of. It's just, again, if there's anything you should be scared of, it's dealing with the housing authority. Now, the upside here is, and I know landlords who have made it their whole business, they do nothing but Section 8. They set out from the beginning, all I'm going to do is rent to Section 8 tenants. And some of them have been very successful, because to a certain extent your rent is guaranteed. Now, it's not quite that great, because for most Section 8 tenants, they actually still pay a portion of the rent. And so you do still need to collect that from them and have a process and a system if they don't pay it and everything else. But you do have a little bit more leverage over those tenants, because they really don't want to lose their voucher. Section 8 vouchers are very hard to get. There's a waiting list years long. And so the people who do have them, they have a great incentive to keep them, which means they need to pay their portion of the rent. And the amount that they pay is calculated using some formula based on their income and the rent amount. some other factors, and it changes every year typically. So you have to keep up with that and pay attention to the paperwork you get, adjust the amount that you're collecting directly from the resident versus from the housing authority. But long story short, you can rely on the rent income by and large coming in from these properties. The cons, talked about some of this, the initial inspection, and then there's an annual inspection thereafter. Very painful, very inconsistent, no clear guidance. All depends on the inspector that you get, whether they had breakfast that morning or a fight with their wife the night before, in terms of what they're going to write you up for, whether they're going to give you a pass or fail. Sometimes they try and write you up for non-issues like cosmetic things that really shouldn't affect it, whereas they should be only looking at functional or safety issues. This can slow everything down and delay the move-in, which therefore delays the rent that you're getting, and it can just be a big hassle. The other thing that can happen, this is more of a newer thing for us, at least in Central Ohio, is that the housing authority, when you decide to kind of accept the tenant and process their paperwork, that's not a guarantee that the housing authority is going to pay you what you were advertising the rent for. What actually ends up happening is you get through that whole process, then the housing authority sends you an offer. Imagine that. Offer all that. All you get is an offer. Hey, here's how much we think we're willing to pay you in rent. Now, maybe it's the market rent you were already asking for, in which case you're great. It used to always be that's what it was. Recently, they've been trying to kind of lowball the property owners and offer them a lower amount than what it was advertised for, which is nonsense in my opinion. And so at that point, you have to make a decision. Do you accept the lower rent and kind of bite the bullet, eat your losses, and just get the property occupied, get the rent flowing? Or do you try to negotiate with the housing authority, or just tell them buzz off and you'll wait for the next tenant, in which case you've lost, so many weeks of occupancy. So challenging. So that's really just scratching the surface of everything you deal with Section 8. This isn't like a Section 8 webinar, so we'll cap it there. But maybe that's enough of a taste to give you a flavor of what it is like. Again, you can make a lot of money doing this, but you got to know what you're doing, or work with a property manager who has a lot of experience. Okay, commercial properties. So my partner and I own 2 commercial properties, and we just happen to occupy both of them. One of them is the building I'm sitting in right now, which is where our property management office is located. The other one is the other business we own, which is an engineering company, also local. These are both sort of suites within larger buildings. They're kind of like the HOA equivalent of commercial. And the nice thing about commercial is you're dealing with a totally different tenant type and lease type in most cases. So a lot of commercial spaces, first of all, they're obviously occupied by commercial tenants who don't live there, which is amazing because they're not calling you at 3 a.m. with a problem. So they're there during business hours, which is mostly when you want to be hearing from tenants anyway. So that's a beautiful thing. And they're also they're not emotional about the space because it's just a workspace. So they're not freaking out because they've got company coming over and the oven doesn't work or something like that. So that whole dynamic, the temperature is just turned way down because it's like business to business. It's very much a rational discussion among business people when there's a problem. So that's great. The lease type often is what's called triple net, which means the tenant is responsible for the property taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance. It's unbelievable if you're coming from the residential world. So now, of course, in exchange, they're paying a lower rent compared to if those things were included. But what it means as the owner is very few headaches because you sign this long lease, like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Some business moves in and you basically never hear from them because they're responsible for maintenance. And they just operate their business and you go about your business and you kind of never talk to each other, and it's a beautiful moment. So that is awesome. Now, they're much harder to fill. So when you do experience a vacancy in a commercial property, it's not measured in weeks. It's measured sometimes in years. So you need to be able to withstand a long vacancy period, long, long, long vacancy period. That is brutal and can be very scary and intimidating to someone who isn't well capitalized to handle something like that. Also tends to be more sensitive to the local economic conditions. If locally businesses are struggling, you're going to have a harder time leasing up the property or getting the rent that you want. Whereas residential rental units are more insulated from that because everyone needs a place to live, regardless of how the economy is doing. So there is that. The whole lease up process is crazy. You end up having to engage like a commercial leasing broker. They negotiate and source these tenants, and there's a big negotiation process where typically the tenants will come in and say, all right, I want you, landlord, to help pay for the cost of the build out because I'm improving your property. And so there's this discussion about this and how it affects the rent and the terms and everything else. You also pay a large fee to that leasing broker in exchange for finding and bringing a tenant to you. So you need to be aware of that as well. So lots of pros and cons here. Not something I would jump into with no experience and no sort of professional assistance, but it can be fantastic. We are experiencing sort of historically high office vacancies right now in the United States, still sort of from COVID. But there's other types of commercial spaces besides office. And I think even office space, if you buy in the right area, I don't think you're going to have trouble filling it or keeping it filled. And the nice thing is once you do find somebody, they're typically in there for many, many, many years. And you just can not worry about it for a really long time. Okay, I want to address a couple of the questions. So Kimberly was asking about corporate rental. So I would call corporate rentals sort of midterm rentals, MTR. Sometimes you hear them referred to, as opposed to STR, short-term rental, or LTR, long-term rental. There's people who do really well here. These corporate rentals, take an apartment or a single-family home and furnish it and set it up and advertise it for business travelers, traveling nurses, companies that have a temporary project in the area, things like that. That can work really well. I don't know a lot about it. It's outside of our area of expertise, and it's not necessarily a specific property type. Usually, it's like apartments or condos that are sort of converted for this type of use just by getting them furnished. So I would compare them to. They're kind of this weird hybrid between short-term rentals and long-term rentals, and you know, I think if you specialize in that, you can do really well. There's a group that actually subleases some space from our warehouse in the back here that specializes in this. They seem like they do really well, but you got to know all the right places to advertise those properties. And of course, the lease terms are going to be different, and you have to figure out how do you handle like the furnished part of it because it's just like a different setup. I mean, you're not going in there every day changing the sheets and stuff like that like you would with a short-term rental, but yeah, so it's an interesting little niche in not an area that we know much about, honestly. Mike said land. I don't know much about land either. They're not making more of it. That's the thing I always hear people say about land. I've never owned raw land or invested in that, but I'm sure there's obviously people who have done incredibly well. The thing I always hear about land is that you want to buy in the path of progress, buy in the path of development, which typically means like wherever your city is, go find the cornfields that are like just outside the furthest extent of the suburbs, buy up a bunch of that, and then just wait 10 or 20 years and you'll end up being really glad that you did. It's kind of a long game, and in the meantime, you've got no revenue coming in. So it's more of like a speculative play than it is an investment. I would categorize it as speculating. But people have obviously gotten really rich doing that, so it's possible. Kimberly asked about 55 plus communities. I don't know anything about that, unfortunately. For property management current clients, if you haven't heard from Lineage, I encourage you to reach out to those folks. If you're watching this webinar and you're this far along into it, you're probably going to enjoy speaking with them. This is a group that we've partnered with that does two things. One, they will review your current portfolio, whether all your properties are with us or not, and they will help you understand how that portfolio is performing. They have some amazing dashboards and graphs and charts that really give you some details in terms of NOI and cash on cash return and return on equity, a lot of the sort of asset level management discussions that frankly they're better at having than we are. And that's why we've partnered with them. The other thing that they do is they will work with you to help you find, identify, and purchase additional properties, whether they're local to Columbus or another market. They will help you. They're kind of like they're almost like financial advisors, but for real estate. Most financial advisors hate real estate, but these guys specialize in working with real estate investors and helping them grow their portfolio. In fact, we have a current client here at RL Property Management who just closed, or I should say, just went in a contract on another property, not in Columbus, but in another market, by working with Lineage. And so they're a great resource. We wouldn't be talking about them to our clients if we didn't believe in what they were doing. So if you're a current client, you can reach out to them. You may have gotten some emails and texts from them. That's all I have. Any questions or comments or other thoughts about investing in the different property types that we've talked about today? Kimberly, we are just in Columbus. We are just in Central Ohio. Okay. Hearing no other questions. How difficult? Okay, so Thomas says, how difficult is a 1031 in Columbus? I don't think it's any different than anywhere else. I hear people doing 1031s all the time, so yeah, I don't think there's any issue with 1031s here. Okay, thank you for coming, everyone, and we appreciate. Hope this was helpful. Bye, all.
Thanks, Peter. See you.